The second thing that changed was as I came to a different understanding of some passages of Scripture. And I like what Frank Viola says. Let me recommend a book to you here. This is one of Frank Viola's books, The Untold Story of the New Testament Church, an extraordinary guide to understanding the New Testament. I recommend it highly. He quotes F.F. Bruce, which is a well-known evangelical scholar, that an important understanding of how you interpret much of the New Testament, especially the epistles, is to realize that what we have here is one side of a telephone conversation. Because in a great many cases, Paul and others are answering questions that someone is asking. So that's the other side of the conversation. And we don't always know what those questions are. We have to kind of work backwards to make an educated guess about those questions. That really helps us with some of these difficult passages in the New Testament. Let me take one for example. In 1 Corinthians 14, we have this passage, starting with 33. For God is not a God of disorder, but of peace, as in all the congregations of the saints. Women should remain silent in the churches. Wow, what does that mean? They are not allowed to speak, but they must be in submission, as the law says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home, for it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in the church. If you take that just at surface value, you might well come to that conclusion that when the church gathers, women should literally remain silent. And if that's true, then there are a lot of us that are in trouble, house churches and traditional churches alike, because obviously women often have something to say. And yet, in the context of Scripture, it clearly can't mean that. Because, for one reason, Paul, just a few verses or a few chapters before, in chapter 11, has said that women, when they speak or prophesy, should have their heads covered. So women were clearly speaking. So whatever chapter 14 means, it doesn't mean that they literally were not to speak. So how do we understand what's going on here? I think Frank gives us a good understanding of the possibilities of the questions that were being asked of Paul. Now, for instance, we can go back to chapter 7, and there Paul kind of introduces this whole idea of some of the questions. He says, now for the matters that you wrote about, and he launches into answering these questions, and he goes through all kinds of things. What do you do when this happens? What do you do when you have church? And there's some people who arrive early and they eat all the food, and some people get drunk, and other people come, and there's nothing left. What do you do with that? What do you do when you have a church service and everybody's speaking in tongues and nobody's interpreting and it's chaotic? What do you do? What do you do when there are all kinds of people prophesying? There's one after another, just going on and on and on. And again, the meeting is chaotic. What do you do in that situation? And then he gives this passage about women being silent. What's the question that's being asked? That's the key thing. Here's Frank's suggestion about that. It says, the meetings of the church in Corinth are chaotic. The gift of tongues is exalted by some because it's seen as the language of angels. Think 1 Corinthians 13 there for his answer. Many are speaking in tongues at the same time during the meetings, and it's creating massive confusion. Further, some of the married women are challenging those who are prophesying with many questions. This is creating both confusion and disruption in our gatherings. What should we do about this? Again, can we say 100% for sure that that's the question? No, we can't. We simply don't know. But I think it's very likely that Frank is onto something in terms of the questions that are being asked. And so, does it literally mean that women should never open their mouth in the context of a house church? I think not. I think he's giving specific instruction to a specific situation, and it's not, I don't think he was ever intending to give an explanation that women, whenever the church gathers, should never speak. So those two things, a changed understanding of the nature of church, and then a better understanding of how to take Scripture in context. That's the key principle, the hermeneutical principle, is that you always interpret Scripture in the original context. And so in this case it means, what exactly was Paul intending to say, and what do his original readers understand him to be saying. Once we're clear about that, then we get a proper understanding or interpretation of this passage. The same applies to 1 Timothy 3. There's a passage in there, or 2, about women. Frank has some comments about that help us understand the context there of Paul talking about women and their role in church.